The last thing I need to do before putting some finish on the project is sand the top. Now this is a large surface or larger surface, and I'm going to use a random orbital sander to sand it. Everything else I've sanded by hand. I sanded this at school on the wide belt sander. The second grit on that is 120. So I'm going to start with 120 grit paper. If the last thing I had done was run it through a planer, I would probably start at about the same grit. It depends whether or not I had snipe, in which case I might start with 100 grit. But 120 is going to work fine for this, since that matches what it was sanded with last. When I use a random orbital sander, I see a lot of people, you know, they've got it running and they're basically doing that. They're moving it just about as quickly as they would if they were sanding by hand. So that just doesn't make sense. If you're going to do that, then sand by hand. The way this is supposed to work is it's called a random orbital sander because it has an orbit to it and this spins. That's the random part. In order for that to work well and not leave little curlicue scratches on your work, you need to move it slowly. What I do and what works well is I'll start at one corner and turn it on, and then I'm going to move it across the board, and I go about 1 inch per second. If this is, whatever, 20, I think it's 24 inches, it should take me about 24 seconds to move across here. And then I'll come down and of course I'll overlap and come back. And so this will take me probably 3 or 4 passes to sand this top. And like I said, about 24 seconds per pass. Now, like with any sanding process, I'm trying to remove the scratches or imperfections from the previous operation. So in this case, it was run on the, like I said, the wide belt sander, and so there were some scratches going this direction. So the only way I can see those well is to get a light down here and take a good look at all the parts of this, and this looks pretty good. I can see maybe some scratches right through here. They're not going to show up on the video, but so that looks pretty good. Now if one pass did not remove those scratches, that means basically one of two things. I chose the wrong grit, or the sandpaper's dull. Right, it shouldn't take you more than 1 pass, maybe 2 passes on the first grit to get rid of those previous imperfections. Once I've got those, in this case, scratches gone, 1 pass with the rest of the grits should work fine. But you really want to look at that first grit, because it's a little bit like sharpening. Sometimes you'll think you've used your 1,000 grit stone and you've got things sharp, but once you get to the 8,000 and you've got some polish, you see that you missed some things at the coarsest grit. So I'll do a quick run over that one area, and then I'll go through the rest of the grits here. Same process, nice slow passes, and then I'll be done. I'm at 180 grit now, and on this next set of passes, I'm going to go the other direction. What I find sometimes is making passes all the same way, you sometimes can see that you've made passes in that direction. So maybe every other grit, I'll go 90 degrees. The last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take some 400 grit paper and sand by hand with the grain. And I only do this on the top. I wouldn't do it on the bottom. On the bottom of the top, we're not even going to sand to as fine a grit. I'll probably stop at 220 on the underside. The top's all sanded now. I did the edges and rounded all the corners a little bit. So the last thing I want to do before putting finish on is check to make sure that the things I sanded previously are still good. So, I mean, just looking, everything looks fine, but I think your hands are going to give you the most feedback on this process. So basically, I just feel all the surfaces, and particularly corners that might have gotten dinged, here or there, that kind of thing, and everything feels fine. The edges around the drawer are they're not rounded as much because that's where the drawer goes, so that feels different, but that's fine. It does feel a little bit sharp on this back edge that isn't seen or even felt, in use, so I'm not too concerned about that. One last thing I want to do before I put the finish on is raise the grain. So when you're sanding, it tends to bind up the grain in the pores of the wood, and by wetting the wood and letting it dry, the fibers raise up, and we can then sand them off. If you don't do that, what will happen is you'll put the finish on and everything will feel fine, but then after whatever, so many months or maybe a year or two, the grain will eventually raise and it won't feel quite as smooth. So this step, I didn't realize that until somewhat recently. So even though it feels great now, you definitely want to raise the grain, particularly on the most visible or the surfaces that might be touched. So I'm going to do this on the top. I'll do it on the edges of the top, not necessarily the underside of the top. I'll do, of course, the drawer front, the aprons, the legs, and I'll ignore, the interior parts. But so the way I'm going to do that, I've got a sponge here and just some clean water. Some people say distilled water. I don't worry too much about that. And I'm just going to wipe this. Definitely want to make sure it gets wet, but I don't want it dripping wet. And this should be enough to get it to raise. So then I'll let it dry, of course, and I'll sand it again with the finest grit. So in this case, I'm just going to sand it with 400 grit just to knock those fibers back down. Then I'll be done and ready to put finish on. So I'm raising the grain on the drawer front. I'm not going to worry about the sides. So 400 grit paper, I'm just sanding everything by hand now, just till it feels smooth again. So next up, we'll get some oil varnish blend and put it on all the parts.